My wife whispered during our anniversary, "I've been seeing someone else for months." I quietly said, "I hope you're happy." The next morning, I took my name off our lease, withdrew my $15,000 savings account, and packed my things. 5 days later, her better man showed up at my door asking for money. Hey folks, before we jump into the video, please consider subscribing and giving a thumbs up if you're excited for more stories like this. Thank you. Let's dive in. Maya and I had been married for 3 years when she chose our anniversary dinner to detonate our life together. We were at Marcello's, this quiet Italian place where we'd had our first official date, sitting across from each other in the same corner booth I'd requested when making the reservation 2 weeks earlier. I'd even ordered the same wine we'd shared that first night, thinking it would be romantic to recreate the moment when I knew I was falling for her. Instead, I was about to learn that the woman I'd been supporting and believing in for 5 years had been living a completely different life behind my back. She waited until after the appetizer to drop the bomb, twirling her engagement ring around her finger in that nervous way she did when she was about to say something she knew would hurt. "Ryan, I need to tell you something," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I've been seeing someone else. For months now. I think I'm in love with him." The words hit me like cold water, but what surprised me most was how calm I felt. Maybe it was because part of me had already known, had been piecing together the late nights at her studio, the expensive clothes appearing in her closet, the way she'd started guarding her phone like state secrets. "His name is Derek. He's a musician and he understands my art in ways that..." She paused, searching for words that would somehow make this less devastating. "He gets the creative side of me that you've never really connected with." I set down my fork and looked at her directly, this woman I'd spent 3 years planning a future with, who I'd supported through art school and career struggles, who I'd believed was building something beautiful alongside me. "I hope you're happy," I said quietly, then went back to eating my osso buco. She stared at me like I'd responded in a foreign language, clearly expecting tears or anger or desperate questions about where this left us. Instead, I finished my meal in complete silence while she fumbled through explanations about finding herself and needing space and how this didn't mean she didn't care about me. When the check came, I paid it without a word, helped her into her coat like the gentleman my parents had raised me to be, and drove us home in silence. That night, she slept in our guest room while I lay awake staring at the ceiling, not heartbroken but strangely relieved that the uncertainty was finally over. The next morning, while Maya was at her studio dealing with what she assumed would be my emotional breakdown, I began the methodical process of dismantling the life we'd built together. First stop was the bank, where I closed our joint savings account and walked out with a cashier's check for $15,000, money that represented 2 years of overtime shifts and my entire inheritance from my grandmother, every penny of which had gone toward supporting Maya's artistic dreams while she focused on her craft. Second stop was our apartment complex, where I met with the landlord and exercised the early termination clause I'd insisted on when we signed the lease, a bit of pragmatic planning that Maya had rolled her eyes at but that now felt like divine inspiration. What Maya didn't know, what I hadn't told her during her tearful confession, was that I'd discovered her affair 3 weeks earlier when I'd accidentally opened her laptop to check our shared calendar and found intimate photos in her automatically synced cloud storage. 3 weeks to process the betrayal, to move through the anger and hurt in private, to plan my exit strategy like the quality control engineer I was, systematically identifying every point of failure and methodically addressing each one. Maya and I had met 5 years earlier at a coffee shop near the art college where she was grinding through her MFA in ceramics while working as a barista to barely cover her rent. I was immediately drawn to her passion for her craft, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about glazing techniques and kiln temperatures, how she saw beauty and possibility in lumps of clay that looked like mud to everyone else. She had this vision of opening an artisanal ceramics gallery downtown, creating functional art that would bridge the gap between everyday objects and fine art, and I believed in that dream completely. What started as offering to help with her $400 monthly student loan payments quickly evolved into me becoming the entire financial backbone of her artistic career. I took a second job doing freelance quality inspections on weekends, spending my Saturdays crawling through manufacturing facilities and construction sites to earn an extra $800 monthly that went directly towards supporting her education and creative pursuits. When Maya graduated with $45,000 in art school debt, I quietly paid it off over 18 months using my inheritance from my grandmother combined with every penny from my weekend work, never once making her feel guilty about the sacrifice because I saw it as an investment in our shared future. The studio space she rented for $800 monthly in the arts district became my responsibility too, along with the business insurance, utilities, and the endless supplies that ceramic work demanded: clay, glazes, firing costs, tools that broke or wore out constantly. When my grandmother passed away and left me $15,000, Maya and I spent an entire weekend researching professional pottery equipment, finally settling on a top-of-the-line electric kiln that cost $8,000 and a professional potter's wheel system that ran another $4,000. I watched her face light up like Christmas morning when the delivery truck arrived, how carefully she arranged everything in her studio space, how she called me at work just to thank me again for making her dream setup possible. For 3 years, I handled every practical aspect of our life: rent, groceries, health insurance through my company plan, car maintenance, emergency funds, while Maya poured herself completely into her art. She'd spend 12-hour days at the studio, coming home covered in clay dust with stories about breakthrough moments in her glazing experiments or excited plans for her first gallery showing. I loved seeing her so passionate and fulfilled, loved that my steady income and practical planning gave her the freedom to be purely creative without worrying about mundane things like whether the rent would be paid or if we had enough saved for unexpected expenses. Looking back, I realize I'd created the perfect conditions for someone to take me completely for granted, but at the time it felt like we were building something beautiful together, her artistic vision supported by my stability and commitment to our shared future. The changes started about 8 months before Maya's anniversary confession, subtle at first but building into patterns that even my trusting nature couldn't ignore. Maya began attending what she called artist networking events almost every weekend, driving to neighboring cities for workshops and gallery openings that somehow required overnight stays at expensive hotels. She'd return home Sunday evenings with shopping bags full of art supplies that she claimed were gifted by fellow artists in the collective, including professional-grade glazes that I knew cost $60 per jar and specialized tools that ran hundreds of dollars each. When I mentioned that her new artist friends seemed remarkably generous, she'd get defensive and lecture me about how the art community supported each other in ways that corporate people like me couldn't understand. The late-night phone calls started around the same time, always about gallery opportunities and collaborative projects that required hushed conversations in our bathroom with the shower running for privacy. Maya began sleeping with her phone under her pillow and taking it everywhere, even to grab coffee from our kitchen, like she was expecting urgent communications that couldn't wait 5 minutes. When I casually asked about her sudden phone attachment, she snapped that her art career required constant networking and that successful artists needed to be available for opportunities that could change everything. Then came the wardrobe transformation that should have been my biggest red flag. Designer clothes started appearing in our shared closet, a $400 leather jacket that she claimed came from her art collective's clothing swap, silk blouses that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and expensive jewelry that she said were bartered pieces from a sculptor friend who works in metals. Maya had always been stylish, but these weren't the vintage finds and thrift store treasures she used to hunt for. These were department store pieces with tags that reflected serious money, the kind of money that definitely wasn't coming from her sporadic pottery sales at weekend markets. Our shared apartment began feeling like a hotel where Maya occasionally slept between her real life happening elsewhere. She'd come home after midnight claiming she'd been in a creative flow state that couldn't be interrupted, smelling like expensive perfume I'd never bought her and wearing clothes that weren't wrinkled despite supposedly spending 14 hours working with clay. Dinner conversations became one-sided reports about her expanding artistic network, mysterious collaborators with names like Jeremy from the gallery scene, and that photographer who's connected to New York buyers, people who seemed to exist in her phone but never materialized as actual humans I could meet. When I suggested we plan a weekend trip together or even just a quiet dinner out, Maya would sigh and explain that she was in a crucial phase of her career development that required total focus, as if spending time with her husband was somehow holding back her artistic breakthrough. The morning after Maya's confession, while she was presumably at her studio working through what she assumed would be my emotional devastation, I executed the exit strategy I'd been mentally rehearsing for 3 weeks with the methodical precision that had made me good at my job. My first stop was our apartment complex office, where I met with the property manager and exercised the early termination clause I'd insisted on including in our lease agreement, a bit of practical planning that Maya had rolled her eyes at when we signed, calling it unnecessarily pessimistic. The clause required a $2,000 penalty fee, which I paid immediately, along with the paperwork to remove my name from the lease effective in 30 days, leaving Maya solely responsible for the full $1,800 monthly rent on her barista wages that averaged maybe $1,200 per month. Next was the bank, where I closed our joint savings account and walked out with a cashier's check for the full $15,000 balance, money that represented every penny of my inheritance from my grandmother, 2 years of weekend overtime work, and the security deposit I'd been building for our future home purchase. Maya's individual checking account remained untouched with its $340 balance, but the financial safety net that had been quietly covering every shortfall and emergency for 3 years was now gone completely. I then drove to Maya's studio and had a conversation with her landlord, Mrs. Chin, who had become genuinely fond of Maya's work and had been flexible about late payments because she knew I was the reliable co-signer. "I'm removing my guarantee from the commercial lease," I explained, showing her the legal forms I'd prepared. "Maya will need to qualify on her own income or find a new guarantor by next month." Mrs. Chen looked genuinely sad as she processed the paperwork, understanding without me having to explain that this meant Maya would likely lose the studio space that had become the center of her artistic identity. My next call was to the business insurance company where I canceled the $200 monthly policy that covered Maya's studio equipment and pottery inventory, followed by a call to the equipment financing company to remove my personal guarantee on the $12,000 worth of professional pottery equipment that was still being paid off monthly. The kiln, potter's wheel, and specialized tools that had transformed Maya's hobby into a legitimate artistic practice were now entirely her financial responsibility, with no backup plan if she couldn't make the payments. By noon, I had systematically removed every thread of financial support that had been holding Maya's artistic life together, like pulling the foundation out from under a house of cards. That evening, I packed my essential belongings into 2 suitcases, arranged for a moving company to collect the rest later that week, and left Maya a brief handwritten note on our kitchen counter. "I hope Derek appreciates what he's getting. Everything else is yours to figure out now." I spent that night in a furnished apartment across town that I'd rented under a 6-month lease, feeling the strange peace that comes from finally matching your actions to reality instead of living in denial about what your relationship actually was. The domino effect began exactly 72 hours after I'd systematically removed every financial support from Maya's carefully constructed artistic life, and it was more devastating than even I had anticipated. Mrs. Chen called Maya demanding immediate payment for 3 months of back rent totaling $2,400 that had been automatically deducted from our joint account, money that Maya had assumed would always be there handling the practical details while she focused on her creative work. When Maya couldn't produce the funds, Mrs. Chen reluctantly began eviction proceedings, giving her 10 days to pay in full or lose the studio space that had been the center of her identity for 3 years. The equipment financing company sent default notices when the business insurance policy lapsed, demanding immediate payment of the remaining $8,000 balance on the professional kiln and potter's wheel, or they would repossess everything within 5 business days. Maya's pottery instructor from the community college called asking about $1,200 in overdue workshop fees that my automatic payments had been covering, threatening to bar her from the advanced classes she needed to maintain her credentials with the local arts council. The gallery space downtown where Maya had been renting weekend booth space for $600 monthly to sell her pottery also sent an eviction notice, since that payment had been coming from our joint account too, cutting off her primary source of income just when she needed it most. Within a week, Maya's entire artistic empire was crumbling like a house built on sand, each financial obligation revealing how completely dependent her creative freedom had been on my stability and planning. Meanwhile, I had quietly arranged to work remotely with my understanding manager, who'd noticed my stress levels over the past month and supported my decision to work through some personal changes from home. My new furnished apartment was small but comfortable, and for the first time in years I found myself enjoying simple pleasures like cooking dinner for one person and watching whatever I wanted on TV without negotiating about Maya's preferred art documentaries or foreign films about creative struggle. The silence in my new space wasn't lonely, it was peaceful, like finally being able to hear my own thoughts after years of background noise I hadn't realized was there. I'd left only a brief handwritten note on our kitchen counter that said, "I hope Derek appreciates what he's getting. Everything else is yours to figure out now." And then I disappeared completely from Maya's life, leaving her to face the financial reality of her choices without the safety net she'd taken for granted for so long. 5 days after I'd vanished from Maya's life, my doorbell rang at 7:30 in the morning, and I opened it to find Derek standing there in complete panic, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He was exactly what I'd expected from Maya's description: mid-20s, artfully messy hair, wearing a vintage band t-shirt and jeans that probably cost more than my work boots, the kind of guy who thought struggling made him more authentic than people with steady jobs. "You're Ryan, right?" he said, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "I'm Derek. Maya told me about you." "Look, man, I really need to talk to you about this whole situation." I invited him in, curious to hear what Maya's better man had to say now that the financial reality was hitting. Derek perched on the edge of my couch like he was ready to bolt, running his hands through his hair repeatedly while trying to find words that would somehow make his request sound reasonable. "Maya's having a complete breakdown," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "She's crying every day about losing her studio and her equipment. She keeps saying you destroyed her entire life out of spite." I stayed silent, letting him work up to whatever he'd actually come to ask for. "The thing is," Derek continued, looking increasingly desperate, "I had no idea how much it costs to support an artist. I thought Maya was just naturally successful, you know? I make maybe $200 a week playing coffee shops and private parties, and I live in my buddy's converted garage. I can't even afford to take her out to dinner, let alone pay for studio space and equipment loans." He paused, staring at his hands like they might have answers written on them. "Maya keeps talking about how you used to handle everything financial so she could focus on her art. She thought, we both thought, that maybe you'd continue helping her out even after she left you. You know, for the sake of supporting her artistic career." The sheer audacity of that assumption left me speechless for a moment. "She wants me to keep paying for her life while she's with you," I said slowly, making sure I understood correctly. Derek's face turned red, but he pressed on with increasing desperation. "Look, I know how this sounds, but Maya's really talented. She shouldn't have to give up her art just because of relationship drama. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement where you handle the financial stuff and I handle the other aspects of the relationship." I stared at him, genuinely wondering if he'd just suggested what I thought he'd suggested. "Are you asking me to financially support my ex-wife so you can sleep with her?" "I'm asking you to be the bigger person here," Derek said quickly. "Maya made a mistake, but her art shouldn't suffer because of it. And honestly, man, I think this could work out better for everyone. You get to feel good about supporting important creative work, Maya gets to pursue her dreams, and I get to be with the woman I love." I looked at Derek sitting on my couch, this grown man who just asked me to bankroll his relationship with my ex-wife, and realized that Maya had found someone even more delusional than I'd given her credit for. "That's not going to happen," I said calmly, standing up to signal that our conversation was over. "But I appreciate you clarifying exactly what kind of person Maya chose over me." Derek left looking defeated, and over the following weeks I learned through our mutual friend network that Maya's entire carefully constructed artistic world had collapsed like dominoes. Without my financial backing, she'd been forced to sell her professional equipment to a used art supply store for a devastating loss, getting only $3,000 for items that had originally cost $12,000, barely enough to cover 2 months of her studio rent before she lost that space too. The gallery landlord had evicted her after she missed 3 consecutive payments, and Mrs. Chen had reluctantly reclaimed the studio space that Maya had transformed into her creative sanctuary over 3 years. Derek had apparently lost interest in Maya once he realized she came with significant financial responsibilities rather than the carefree artistic lifestyle he'd romanticized, and he'd disappeared back to his friend's garage apartment within 2 weeks of his visit to my door. Maya's parents had driven down from Michigan to help her pack up what remained of her pottery supplies and move her back into their spare bedroom, a crushing blow to someone who'd spent 5 years building an independent artistic identity. Through the grapevine, I heard that Maya had made several desperate attempts to contact me directly, alternating between angry voicemails accusing me of sabotaging her dreams out of spite and tearful messages begging for reconciliation, promising she'd learned her lesson and would never take me for granted again. I maintained complete radio silence, having learned that the best response to manipulation is no response at all. Meanwhile, my own life had taken an unexpected turn for the better. Working remotely had given me time to explore interests I'd neglected during my years of supporting Maya's career, and I discovered a genuine passion for woodworking in the garage workshop of my new apartment complex. There was something deeply satisfying about creating functional beauty with my own hands, about the precise measurements and careful planning that went into building something that would last. I'd also started dating Sarah, a fellow engineer from a sister company who I'd met at a professional development seminar, someone who appreciated stability and shared goals rather than seeing them as boring limitations on her creativity. Sarah and I would spend evenings planning weekend hiking trips and discussing our career goals, simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after years of walking on eggshells around Maya's artistic temperament. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy and optimistic about the future, grateful that Maya's betrayal had freed me to find someone who actually valued what I had to offer instead of just taking it for granted.